Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And Prime Minister's questions comes to an end there. Jeremy Corbyn went on benefits for the disabled. He linked it to homelessness as well, and wanted to know why homelessness was rising, and particularly the poor and disabled numbers were rising too. They traded statistics with the Prime Minister. The Leader of the Opposition then broadened it out more into the general attack on the budget and how the budget figures would now add up, given that the government is saying now it won't go ahead with other welfare cuts, though we'll come back to that in a minute. But it then ended with the Prime Minister falling back on a bit of a gimmick, but it was a gimmick that worked, which is this list of Labour MPs. I think there are now 5 categories, and they're divided by a Corbynista, I think, into whether they're hostile or friendly, core support or hostile to Jeremy Corbyn. And the Prime Minister was able just to go in town on that, pointing and say, well, you're core friendly, you're core hostile. And then he said, put up your hands, all those who are core support. And of course, the Prime Minister and half the Tories all put up their hands. And that's how the Mother of Parliaments came to an end at Prime Minister's questions today. So what did our viewers make of it?
A lot of viewers thought that Jeremy Corbyn pursued the right topics but missed an open goal in terms of nailing the Prime Minister on the changes. So John Wakefield from London said Jeremy Corbyn was quite right to pursue David Cameron on his Chancellor's attempt to give tax cuts to the well-off at the expense of the poor and disabled. Ian Whiteley said Corbyn had an open goal to aim. He kicked the ball hard. It ricocheted off Cameron's crossbar and into his own net. Jeremy Corbyn started OK, but Cameron batted him away and started enjoying himself. Stephen Wilson said Jeremy Corbyn asked David Cameron what he knew about hardship. This from a man who was privately educated and lives in an expensive property in Islington. And John Douglas Gray said after 2 terms in government, how long can the Conservatives bang on and on about the debt they were left by the Brown government? Am I missing something, or is PMQ supposed to be the Prime Minister answering questions, not attempting a bad stand-up act?
And while we've been watching that, Laura, there's been a demonstration, I think, of a disabled lobby in the central lobby of the Commons.
In the central lobby, which is literally just outside the Commons chamber. There's been a group, I think a couple of dozen of people who are angry about what's happened with the disability cuts, who've gone to protest. John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, has apparently gone out to go and address them. And I suppose that's a sign of, actually, as some of our viewers were suggesting, that Jeremy Corbyn probably picked the right issue today. But whether he actually managed to get very far with the Prime Minister is a very different question. And look, think about the last week. That should probably have been one of the worst Prime Minister's questions that David Cameron's ever faced in his whole 6 years as Prime Minister.
Because it's been his worst week.
But by the end, he was cracking gags. He was the one who looked like he was in charge. He looked like he was enjoying every minute, partly because of that list that you were talking about. And also what will make its way into much of the coverage of that, and maybe one of the headlines, is a very unfortunate tweet that was sent by one of the Labour backbenchers during that session, who was already in the hostile category, I should say. But John Woodcock, no stranger to this programme. I'm not going to use the language as it's rather rude.
I'm glad to hear that, because this is a daytime programme watched by Her Majesty the Queen and by young children and students learning about politics.
Indeed. So I shall paraphrase John Woodcock's description of what just happened in the last half hour, but it was a something disaster. The worst week for Cameron since he came in, and that stupid something list makes us look like a laughing stock. Now, that is his view of Prime Minister's questions, who someone's on the Labour backbenches, but that is what will be picked up.
He's deleted it, hasn't he, now?
Yeah.
Yes,
but it's doing the rounds.
It's too late. It's doing the rounds.
Gone.
The dangers and the delights of social media mean that very little stays private for long. I suspect he was probably trying to send it to someone as a DM, a direct private message.
Always a mistake
or a
to
slip
use
of the
Twitter
finger.
for direct messages.
Why? How do you know?
Moving along. Which of the 5 categories are you in on this list, Rachel?
Well, I think the list is really disappointing. This week, all Labour MPs have been in the chamber, trying to hold the Prime Minister and Osborne to account for these cuts to
when there's
personal
been a lot
independence
to hold them
payments.
to account.
Yes, exactly, and we've all been working together on that. And then a list like this, which categorises us in this sort of
drawn it up?
childish way, I think it is really disappointing because look, the people who we are hostile to are the Conservatives, who are the government, and all the Labour MPs are trying to work together to get another Labour government and get rid of the Tories. And so I just wish that the Leader's office, if it comes from the Leader's office, would concentrate on holding the Tories to account rather than trying to divide the Parliamentary Labour Party, which is the only thing that list does.
We should say that Jeremy Corbyn's office has said, look, they don't recognise this list, they don't have knowledge of it, they're not at all
So
confirming that it's come from them. The
though?
suspicion is that it was actually people in and around his circle. The suggestion has been, not confirmed, that it was Katie Clark, former Labour MP, who's now his political secretary, who was involved in putting it together. It's also important to note, just briefly, that the list, the alleged, whoever actually did it, it was apparently drawn up in January. And if we think of those early days in the new year where things actually had been sort of much more bumpy for Jeremy Corbyn around that sort of pantomime, around the kind of reshuffle time. So,
Well,
Can we rule out Tory dirty tricks?
Well, my colleagues in the lobby who got hold of this list, I think, have got a pretty good track record of being able to find things that are genuine or not. But
it's an
not
internal list.
which
Which category are you in,
Well, it's
Rachel?
quite interesting that Laura says that this was written in January, because in January I'd just come back from maternity leave. I've been off work for 6 months.
Indeed,
So
we missed
I'm not
you.
sure how hostile I was in
So you're in the
January.
hostile
I'm
character?
in the hostile list.
Is that-
so
are you-
I'm not sure what I was doing when I was on maternity leave that so upset somebody
you
in
must
the
do-
Hostility at a
office.
distance.
Exactly.
Perhaps. But, as I say, the only people this benefits to the Conservatives and Labour this week have been working incredibly well together on asking some of those difficult questions, and these sorts of lists have no place in the parliamentary.
Do
Labour
you
Party.
wear the being on the hostile column with annoyance or with a sense of pride?
Oh, I don't want to be I want to be in
you
a
are.
column that is the Labour MPs column, and I want us to work together to hold the.
No, you've made that point.
Conservatives,
But are
to
you happy
account.
or sad to be in the hostile bit?
Well, I'm sad that there is such a list. I think it's totally ridiculous and counterproductive.
It certainly it gave the Prime Minister a get out of jail card today,
Oh yes,
didn't it?
it's brilliant for the
Got him off the hook.
Conservatives. And look, I don't want to agree with everything that John Woodcock wrote in that tweet, but it does make us look silly and a laughing stock.
Right.
And
But
it's,
maybe
we
not
don't want to move the conversation
But
on.
maybe not entirely off the hook, because when the leader of the opposition asked the Prime Minister if there would be any more welfare cuts, the Prime Minister's reply was there'll be no more cuts other than what's in the Conservative manifesto. Now, the Conservative manifesto included £12 billion of welfare cuts. So is that still government policy?
Well, the Prime Minister outlined that today, and it backs up what I said earlier on today, which is, obviously a couple of weeks ago, the Parliament voted on some welfare cuts. There's no more plan beyond what's in the manifesto and what was voted
So
on
there
just a
will
few weeks
be, in
ago.
this Parliament, there will be £12 billion of welfare cuts, and they'll be on the working poor.
Well, we've always actually been very clear, the Prime Minister himself has been very clear, that we will always ensure that it pays to work and will protect the most vulnerable in society.
I understand
so
the
I don't
reason,
accept
but-
the second part of that.
Well,
but
hold
we have
on,
also,
but
but he
I'm
has
only
been very
quoting Ian
clear.
Duncan
We will
Smith.
actually make sure that we deliver on our manifesto.
So Ian Duncan Smith said they had already made £22 billion worth of cuts to welfare for the working poor, and there was, because you've ring-fenced pensions, you've ring-fenced the NHS and everything associated with that, the £12 billion was coming out of cuts to the working poor. That's where the, otherwise, why not? But never mind where they come from. Can we just get you to confirm that there will still be £12 billion of welfare cuts in this Parliament?
Well, Prime Minister himself has been very clear today. We would deliver on our manifesto pledge, and we will actually deliver on the legislation we passed just a couple of weeks
yes
ago.
is the answer.
So we've always been very clear. We've got to get the deficit down. We've got to get that debt down, and that does involve reducing the welfare budget. But that it does not necessarily.
So where will it come from?
But that can also be around actually, and one of the real successes we've seen, as has been outlined earlier today, is getting more of those people back into work.
I understand that, but
so
these 12 billion assumes that you add another 500,000 or so jobs by 2020. That's in the OBR projection. They've banked that.
Yeah.
Where will the 12 billion come from?
Well, obviously we've got an autumn statement coming up later this year, and in light, as the Chancellor himself outlined yesterday, in light of the decisions that have been made, responding to what people have said, obviously we will feed back on that, and that does that in line with that welfare cap position.
So where is it going to come from?
Well, we've been very clear. We've got to get the deficit down. We will deliver on our manifesto.
No, I know that. I'm not
We
asking
will
you that.
also make sure we have
Give
the
me an
surplus.
idea, give our viewers an idea that if there's still 12 billion of cuts on the cards on welfare, which by a process of elimination is going to be largely on the working poor, where will it come from?
Well, as I say, I don't accept the second part of that. In that
Okay,
I
well,
would
answer the
see
first
more and more
part.
people get into higher
Yes,
paid
well,
jobs.
answer
But I
the first
also
part.
think, actually, one of the key things, I'm not going to prejudge today or be tempted into prejudging what...
So we're still in the same situation as we were during the election. When I asked you, people like you,
and DWP,
no, but I asked
deliver on
people
those
like you
promises.
again and again, where was the 12 billion coming from? And answer came there, none. And now, almost a year after the election, you're telling me answer still comes there, none.
Well, I'm saying to you very clearly, we've said we would deliver on our manifesto pledge, we will protect the most vulnerable, but I'm not going to prejudge what will come in the economy over the next 4 years, and indeed even at the next autumn statement.
Well, at the Treasury Select Committee, which I serve on earlier this week, the chairman of the Office for Budget Responsibility, Robert Choate, said that the government will miss its welfare cap by £20 billion over the course of this Parliament. And the fact is you can't cut social security spending without hurting the most vulnerable, because social security spending goes to people who are disabled and
No, we
can't
know
work,
all
people
that.
are out of work and people on
I
low pay.
understand that.
So the
Briefly.
reality is it is going to
Laura?
hurt poor people.
Just one thing worth noting through all of this. In the end, he might have had to resign to do it, but Ian Duncan Smith's actions did actually get ministers to commit not to raiding the welfare budget any further.
So,
through the
but I'm
Christmas
still
budget.
puzzled, Laura. Is the 12 billion a commitment or not? It was in the manifesto.
Indeed, and much of the 12 billion cuts have actually already been agreed and legislated from, and this is part of the legislation that's already gone through. So
But
the
not
real
all the
question-
12 billion.
Not all of it, but the real question this week has been about whether or not the DWP would be expected to cough up with the £4 billion of
And that's no.
savings.
That bit I
That
get.
is a no, and it was a very nifty move worth noting by the new Secretary of State for Department for Work and Pensions. It's not entirely clear whether or not the Chancellor and Prime
I
Minister
suspect
really
he
wanted
made
to
it
go
a
that
condition of
far.
taking the job.
I'm sure he probably did.
Laura, thank you very much. And just mind your language. When you're quoting,
Goodness knows what happens
when you're
when I'm
quoting
right.
these MPs,
We've
you've got to be
very
careful.
very careful of Twitter.
Daytime telly after all. Now
I've been getting